So, in this debate, I end up voting negative, and I think the reason why I end up voting negative is, well, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason is I think that the plausible evidence indicates the state's collapse is inevitable is better than just sort of what you give it credit for in the 2AR. That does have some warrants to it, that the state seeks to continuously minimize, and even when people participate in it, render those individual voices absent, which means that the state as a institution and apparatus is one that would not actually be able to continue to survive in terms of the long haul, and it makes a claim at the end of the card that instead of trying to reform it, it ought to be abandoned so that we can have to reclaim the lives that have been rendered bare as a way to put that out there instead. So to me, I think that gains access or it creates tension with your ability to just like we need to reform the system in order to make the system better, because if the system's inevitably going to fall apart, then it becomes difficult to see how the reformation is going to be beneficial. The second thing is that in regards of your arguments about how the law would be able to solve, in terms of both the solvency debate on the case debate proper, as well as like in relation to the government, how the sovereign could take away power simultaneously and go back and forth along those lines, is that a lot of it comes down to the question of perception. We are able to create a positive perception of how these things be able to take place. To me, I think that perception argument relies on like the actual implementation of plan, which is not necessarily what you're doing in your framework, where we have to engage in terms of institutions, utilize debate as part of a process opposed to a product. And so if debate is a process and not a product, what perception is being created? Because a lot of it's like the perception that Nigeria would have, or the perception other nations have, the perception that individual people beyond that would have. And so to me, I think I'm not sure how that perception argument would relate in terms of the people that exist in terms of these individualized spaces as a way to be able to gain access to solving. So I think that instead of going for the perception argument, I think that a more concrete example of how laws have been utilized progressively in better ways that have actually solved things would be beneficial, opposed to just sort of being like, well, fiat could do it, and we get a perception. Doesn't matter really if these people are actually linked or released, because it's about trying to engage that form of system. Instead of doing that, having situations of how it has empirically worked, how these things have gotten better, would be sort of a better way to gain access to those arguments in relation to framework, because then when you start saying we need to be able to utilize the debate space to work through institutions and create the sort of institutional change and awareness that we could then use, then I can see how the institution that you're saying that we should have this agency around is one that is beneficial, opposed to one that you almost admit is empty but has a perception effect that could then take place.
So you do not evaluate the perception component?
Well, I think that, I don't know what to me the perception seems like it's a Nigerian international perception, a perception of a strength of a rule of law that I don't know what that means in relation to if debate is a process and not a product, because that means that it seems that perception argument is contingent upon like us actually seeing that being realized as a product. So to me, I think that explaining that with the perception of us, linking that perception argument that's on the solvency argument is like in relation to the framework argument could be a way to get me to see how that perception argument would be able to solve back those sort of legal questions. Otherwise, I think that I'm not sure how your engagement with the institution would be able to create the perception that you seem to be talking about in the other areas of the flow. Does that make sense to you?
I guess, sure.
Okay. I think that that's the first thing that I have issue with. The second thing is that I think that in regards to framework, when you say that we need to be able to utilize debate as a space to be able to have institutional organizational change in order to be able to sort of confront these things, I think that there are two things that go on here for me. The first is that institutional change does not seem to have to, and organizational change does not always have to be the government, and that's one of the arguments that you make, right? And you give examples of like how, what happened at Harvard and how other instances have been able to have an organizational effects and organizational structures and things along those lines. But to me, I'm not sure, again, how that organizational interaction is one that they would not also be able to get access to, because they're creating a point where where they're saying is what they're doing is engaging with the institution debate, engaging with the organization of debate as institution in order to be able to sort of reformulate power relations. And so I'm not necessarily sure why putting the government at the center point of that institutional change is essential to talk about institutions in its entirety. And I think that that's especially true based upon the way that you deploy the use of the government interactions as a way to affirm democratic values and democracy, when there's a press that's going on throughout the debate about how democracy and the concept of it is one that will always inevitably leave out the question of the non-human, which is the Cauchy evidence and the evidence which is red in the 1NC, and then there's a long card that's red in the block that is good about how that democracy is not a concept that could be reformed because of the way that it will always be able to leave out those that are rendered not fully human, and that essentially becomes a non-starting point for it. They tag it, when they sort of extend and go for that argument, it becomes a question of the way in which we need to, tear away from these systems. Otherwise, these sort of implications all essentially become inevitable in this regards. The argument that I spent time looking at is your claim about the way in which bare life, the distinction between bare life and bare life and good life, and that dichotomy that's set up by the negative is one that sort of renders other values incomplete. And I think that is something that the 2NR should spend more time actually interacting and answering with. But the answer that's there is that the evidence in articulation assumes just a human conception of that dichotomy. And when I look at the evidence, it clearly does, because the reason for why it says that it is important not to make those distinctions is specifically so that way people can produce alternative strategies that escape the reduction and manage subtle tactics to transform their life into a political instrument that human beings could use to be able to make forms of their lives, right? So their one answer that they give to it, that is a question of focusing on human, is absolutely true in the case of this, because then there's not a situation of, or explanation that I think you could make in the 2AR about where sort of like how a pig in the slaughterhouse could be able to turn into a political instrument, how that form of bare life is not, or that sort of dichotomy then also renders it inoperable. And the argument that you make is that it's still an external ascription onto them, by them, onto these other animals. But the reason for why that's bad is only bad for those individuals who have access to things like democratic principles to transform their lives into being political. And if the democratic principles aren't something that non-humans have access to, then that becomes something that becomes not a need for them to be able to sort of be able to move beyond the way that the way that this dichotomy would otherwise be destructive. I also think that in terms of laying out the 2AR, I think that it would be better spent instead of extending the extinction type impacts, which assumes that like you both relatively admit that the debate is not going to actually be able to solve extinction or do anything like that. So instead of putting the focus on there, putting more of the focus on your framework question and hashing out more about why that engagement with the state in terms of confronting Islamophobia will be able to spend there, and having more analysis on that opposed to a direct weighing of impacts, because, right, they don't really solve the end of, non-human oppression either. You don't solve the prevention of wars or things that take place. To me, it's a question of who would best be able to create a method of engaging in order to be able to activate forms of change. And I think that there's a better description about how, or a explanation about how in the world of their alternative about eliminating that inside-outside distinction in order to be able to figure out who's within the law and who's outside the law, who's within democracy and who's outside democracy. Is there a better way for us to be able to confront institutional forms of violence and engage in these organizations with being able to pull ourselves away from these sort of legal instruments that otherwise sort of codify these sort of mechanisms, opposed to a rigid defense of utilizing the legal instrument, the law. And I think that the 1AR, like what the 1AR does on those questions and reads, reads examples about how the legal instruments could be used. I think that could be where more of the 2AR focus is in order to be able to compel me to see the law as a valid instrument of change, right? And I think that more time spent there versus some of the other stuff, like in terms of perception and, in regards to, like, we will stop total extinction of everything, would be a more convincing way to go about getting my ballot in relation to this individual round. And so that's sort of how I end up making my decision. I think that structurally, I think that on the negative side, I think that the 2NC is obviously top-heavy. Should get to the bottom more. I think that the 1AR could capitalize on that a lot more by dropping down to those cards that are being read, like rejecting human-centeredness, undermines feminist tools. There, I just have, the 1AR quickly just flippantly says, well, it assumes that we're all situated as privileged humans and there's no impact because it's still a feminist specious stance, right? A 1AR going to that card, spending time on that card, or any of the other ones that is forced for the 1NR to take, or the ones that the 2NC more or less just like quickly goes through, like, your no root cause claim. He's like, so we must accept ontology as being good. There's no form of violence that's happening now. They reify the human-animal divide. It's just like, we're not doing that, and then it's like a move-on type situation. Any one of those cards could have been great things to collapse to in the 1AR. The 1AR almost sort of restarts the debate by making a series of new arguments. It's not new in the sense that it's responsive to what they're doing, but it's new in the sense that it's not building off what the 2AC had already done.
Yeah, I thought the K was more of like an intro K and the 1NC, and then became more of an Agamben K and the block, so that's trying to respond to that new stuff. Do you think the old stuff was still responsive?
Yeah, I think the old stuff was still very much responsive, but I think that you're right. It became a lot more law Agamben focused in the block. But, to me, there was a heads up of that when they read the alternative card, and the alternative card wasn't really we have to assume the standpoint of the animal, or we have to reject specious logic, but it was an inside-outside type argument. And so to me, there was like a hint of that was in the 1NC, but you're right. I think that in the 1AR, you did need to make those new arguments, but I think that getting to the offense that the 2AC had would have been important, because then what ends up happening is you sort of seed a lot of that, you seed a lot of the sort of ways that the impacts be able to get framed, and you seed a lot of the offense that you have against their forms of alternatives. And now, they might be right in their articulation, or they might be wrong in their articulation. I don't know that, but when the block just has a answer, and it's just sort of straight out there, is like perceptually, like, in a round like this, I'll be flow-oriented in that case, and you could be like 1AR is like, they radically mishandle it, hold them to the single answer, here's now my analysis, pulling it out, and then read an additional card that fully impacts that out, and then I think that would be an easy way to be able to win that ballot in that regards. The other thing I want to talk about was the performative contradiction argument, which I think is interesting and something to be able to do. I think, though, like, in order to be able to go for performative contradictions, like, there's a bunch of justifications when on the conditionality in relation to performative contradictions that's given in the block. So to me, I think that you need to sort of deal with some of those questions in order to be able to go for it as, what does insincerity mean if I'm voting for the alternative? Am I voting for a team, or am I voting for an alternative? And I think that you all could be clearer in terms of answering that, answering those sort of distinctions. But I think that with this is the best way to test this in order to be able to come up with the best way, be able to come down to the resolving of the arguments in order to being able to sort of choose what we go for at the end. We'll pick the sincerity of what we believe are some of the arguments that are given in terms of the conditionality flow. So I think to go for the performative contradiction stuff, you have to deal with some of those stuff on the theory debate proper in order for me to be able to sort of like hold them to some of those 1NC speech acts. And I think that that would be the way to do that. And I think that, it could get me leeway on the permutation, but I think for the permutation you need to have a defense of the democratic principles that exist in the 1AC that is not as explicit, come the end portion of the debate, as well as like the defense of the law. So that way I see it as like, even if there might be some residual links, I could look past those residual links, but now where do we go from here? But if the permutation still includes an attempt to sort of extend that democracy outward, and I think that democracy as a result of the debate is something that will always include the non-human, that would be problematic. And there's things that you could point to, like for instance, like different countries have granted legal personhood to like orcas and great apes and things like that, and have utilized the law to include other animals within those processes. At one point, like, blacks were not considered human, and they were outside the legal system, and once we granted that personhood, then suddenly they were put into the legal system and got legal protections. And while those might not be perfect, right, obviously racism still exists, it is showing how the legal instruments can be reformed effectively. And so those sort of examples would be ones that I could see as ways in which, the card that you give me in terms of like, the Ferguson evidence talks about how, specific government modes, even if conservative, can be recouched in order to be more progressive. Like, then I have a specific example of how that would be able to be utilized and how it's historically been utilized for how democracies can come around to being able to include these things, but then would become responsive to their Cauchy evidence that's being extended. So I think that would be the way that you could then go for the permutation without me thinking, well, even if I give you the perm, sort of the overwhelmingness of what you get with the affirmative ends up being counterproductive, would be what I'd say. Questions?
I appreciate the comments.
Yeah. Thanks for debating. And I'll email you the two people who sent me links. I'll email you the link to the videos, so that way you can have it and everything.
Great.
Okay. Thanks.